2022 is set to be a celebration of special education. Exceptional Children's Week was established by our supporting professional organization, the Council for Exceptional Children, or CEC. In 2022, CEC is celebrating 100 years of leading information, resources, and professional development for special educators. For our celebration year, the theme for Exceptional Children's Week in Georgia and in Clayton County is Celebrating the Past, Committed to the Future, where we are celebrating 100 years of supporting students with disabilities along with CEC. As a kickoff to this week's information, connections, festivities, and celebration of disability, each day we will share with you knowledge of our history of disability from our past and more information into our progress toward the future. Today, we are discussing the history of special education, the laws and influences which have shaped us. Back in 1922, the International Council for the Education of Exceptional Children was organized by a group of administrators and supervisors attending a summer session at Teachers College, Columbia University, and their faculty members. Like many beginnings, it was small, and the council began with just 12 members. Elizabeth Farrell was the founder and first president. In these small beginnings, special education was not what it is today, and disability activists, parents, and educators have grown, fought, and worked hard in the last 100 years for access and equity in education for students with disabilities. In the 1920s to the 1940s, the organization was established and began working on professional standards for the field of special education. The organization was originally affiliated with the National Education Association, or NEA. During this time, the governance was established and the first journal for exceptional children, later renamed Exceptional Children, in 1951, began. However, there was not much movement in the legal area to support the field of special education. Students with disabilities in this era were not truly provided with direct access to public education. In fact, due to prior Supreme Court decisions, the ability to exclude children with disabilities from education continued throughout this time frame. Parents with children with special needs who could not access public education were faced with the decision to educate their children at home or choose state institutions for handicapped individuals. These institutions may have lacked funding and resources needed to support all students and may not have focused on education, but instead on simply caring for basic needs for the children located there. In the 1950s, the parent organization revised their constitution and developed Special Interest Division. Out of this, the Teacher Education Division and Council for Administrators of Special Education, or CASE, were first formed in 1953. In 1958, the International Council for Education of Exceptional Children was renamed into the Council for Exceptional Children, or CEC, which we know today. Meanwhile, in legislation, landmark cases were helping to make headway for access to public education for children with disabilities. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case that it was unconstitutional for educational institutions to segregate children by race. This landmark ruling became a major stepping stone in equal access, providing far-reaching implications for special education. The late 50s and early 60s saw the federal government begin the support and advocacy of family and practices for children with disabilities. There were several other federal legislative actions that provided basis for public education and special education services related to training of personnel, captioning of films, and more that occurred in this time. In the 1960s, more parents and teachers began to understand the impact of students with disabilities being excluded from education. In the 1960s, the push in education became focused not only on equal access to education, but also federal funding for primary and secondary education. However, in the 60s, schools still had the ability to accept or exclude children with disabilities. In 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson as part of his war on poverty. This action provided the first step of access and direct grant funding for students with disabilities in public education. Over in CEC, the council established a national convention with professional standards as their theme. There were additional offices and student CEC chapters established as they began working to bring in pre-service teachers to our organization. In 1969, CEC separated from the National Education Association and established their separate professional organization for educators of students with disabilities. They began a governmental relations unit at the CEC headquarters. It was clear that it was time to push for direct, specific legislation for students with disabilities. Well, additional pushes came in the form of well-known cases. In 1971, two landmark cases made their impact directly for students with disabilities. In Park versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania ruled in favor of students with intellectual and learning disabilities in state-run institutions to be placed in publicly funded school settings, which met their individual education needs as determined through a proper and thorough evaluation. The second case was Mills versus Board of Education of the District of Columbia. In this case, the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia ruled that students classified as exceptional included those with mental, learning, and behavioral disabilities. This ruling of inclusivity meant that it was unlawful for the D.C. Board of Education to deny individuals with any of those disabilities access to publicly funded educational opportunities. In 1972, due to the outcomes of these two landmark cases, Congress pushed to investigate education for students with special needs. A congressional investigation was established. The goal of the congressional investigation of 1972 was to uncover how many children with special needs were potentially being underserved. Additionally, in 1973, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was approved, stating that no public entity shall exclude people solely on the basis of disability. This applied to public schools and established civil rights for children with disabilities. This landmark determination and the congressional investigation, among many other events and cases, led Congress to develop a specific law governing education for students with disabilities. Finally, in 1975, a law specifically for education of children with disabilities was established. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act, known as EHA, or Public Law 94-142, was passed by the U.S. Congress and signed into law by Gerald Ford. CEC played a major role in bringing this to Congress and supporting the passage of this foundational law. In this law, special education was established as requiring public schools to provide appropriate educational service or a free appropriate public education for all children with disabilities between the ages of 3 and 21. At the time of passing this law, as a result of the congressional investigation of 1972, the Bureau of Education for the Handicapped found that there were nearly 8 million children with disabilities who required special education services. Of those 8 million, 3.9 million may have educational needs adequately met, where 2.5 million children were either educated inappropriately or receiving a substandard education, and nearly 1.75 million children were fully excluded from school. Following the passage of this law, special education began to take off. In the 1976-77 school year, nearly 3.7 million students ages 3 to 21 were served under EHA. Meanwhile, CEC published guidelines for personnel in the education of exceptional children and formed a partnership with the National Council for Accreditation of Teacher Education for approving training programs for teachers. Near the end of this decade, CEC amended its commitments and responsibility to exceptional children policies. CEC demonstrated its growth through adding an ethnic and multicultural groups chapter and adding policies on ethnicity and exceptionality, identification, testing and placement, programming and curriculum adaptation, technical assistance and training, special projects, cooperation with organizations, disciplines, and individuals, and interpreters and translators for culturally and linguistically diverse individuals. As you can imagine, heading into the 1980s, special education finally began to gain recognition and traction as students with disabilities gained access to positive programming in public education. CEC has grown and promoted professional standards, established awards for students with disabilities, and a Teacher of the Year award to honor a CEC member in special education. In the 80s, we saw two more legislative additions that positively impacted special education. In 1984, the Carl D. Perkins Vocational Education Act, Public Law 98-524, was passed, and included restructuring and strengthening accessibility to and qualification of vocational programs for the nation's individuals with disabilities. This was done through comprehensive restructuring for both physical and programming aspects of vocational education nationwide. In 1986, the EHA was reauthorized by Congress as Public Law 99-457. This one added a Part C to address early intervention. This addition mandated that individual states provide services to families of children born with disabilities from the time they are born, where public education is not available, until a child reaches the age of 3 and connects to the public school services. It was truly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s where we saw the influence of the laws for access and the civil rights movement make their true mark in the world of disability and education. In 1980-81 school year, roughly 4.1 million students aged 3 to 21 were served under the EHA. The final landing spot for most of our legal basis in special education and disability access today happened as late as 1990. In 1990, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was reauthorized and rewritten into the Americans with Disabilities Education Act, or ADA, providing access for people with disabilities in the world, business, education, etc. The ADA emphasized the basic tenets of non-discriminatory practices for people with disabilities, including children with disabilities in public education. Further, the EHA was reauthorized once again into Public Law 110-476, which finally changed the name into the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. This change first introduced people first language by demonstrating the importance of putting the person indicator before the word disability, identifying students with disabilities rather than, say, a disabled or handicapped child. By the time we arrived to the 1990-91 school year, the number had grown to 4.7 million infants, toddlers, and children and youth with disabilities from birth to age 21 served under IDEA. The 1990 reauthorization also added eligibility areas, which our world had developed and come to better understand, like traumatic brain injury and autism. Congress also mandated, as part of the student's IEP, that we address the individual transition plans and help a student transition to life beyond school or post-secondary. In the 90s, our world of special education began to blossom as children with disabilities attended public schools and teachers began training to understand how to address children with special needs in the public school environment. We also finally saw in the 80s and 90s the institutions of the past close their doors or change into accessible programs for students based on individual levels of need. Meanwhile, CEC continued working on intensive training for exceptional bilingual students, published the first CEC newsletter, and this is the time frame where CEC passed a resolution to establish an International Exceptional Children's Week. It was referred to a committee for study in 1991 and later established to grow into our weekly practice that we celebrate today. CEC has continued to develop more publications in support of political action for professionals in our field and for children with disabilities. As we continue, in 1997, IDEA was again reauthorized through Public Law 105-17. This one articulated new challenges to improve results for children with disabilities and their families. This update included emphasis on access to the general curriculum. It also gave states the ability to expand developmental delay up to the age of 9 and required parents to provide an opportunity to attempt to resolve disputes with the schools and local education agencies through mediation. This reauthorization also required states to begin tracking new data to address disproportionality in special education and report the number of students in special education by 5 race or ethnicity categories, including American Indian, Asian Pacific Islander, Black, Hispanic, and white or non-Hispanic. IDEA was last authorized in 2004 to align with No Child Left Behind Act requirements. The information that was added to the law included greater accountability and improved educational outcomes. It also raised the standards for instructors who teach special education classes. From 2000 to 2022, we have continued to grow in special education through tracking data, developing new research, and gaining better understanding of diagnosing and teaching students with disabilities. Our professional organizations remain committed to training, recruiting and teaching professionals, advocating for political action, and collaborating with other professional organizations. The technology and the concept of equity in education has grown in the last 18 years. IDEA has not been revisited or reauthorized by Congress. The Office of Special Education Services, however, continues to revise regulations and issue updates to clarify and strengthen implementation of IDEA from the federal level. In the last 47 years since the law first passed mandating FAPE for students with disabilities in public schools, our schools continue to grow and develop in research and knowledge of providing intensive support, resources, and assistance that our children with disabilities require. In the last 100 years, in this lengthy time, we have come far, and it is time to celebrate our past and be committed to the future of education for students with disabilities. In Clayton County Public Schools, we are committed to high performance through equity in education and inclusive practices for all students with disabilities. Happy Exceptional Children's Week.